there is only one thing on which life and civilization depends, and that is soil. From soil arises life, and in its evolution it has always continuously got to depend upon soil. Soil is the decisive need for life. That is the origin of life, soil. If that is so, we must try to find out what soil is all about. What is soil? What is soil? Generally, we look to soil as just soil material made up of sand or clay or whatever it is. It's a gravel or rock dust and all that thing. Now, if life depends upon soil, unless you see soil itself is a living thing, you cannot get life out of it. You can't get life out of a non-living thing. So, you cannot get life from a non-living thing. Life can arise only from a living thing. So, our attitude towards soil must be to think first and foremost as living soil, not as something non-living. This is the first requirement is if we want to deal anything about soil or soil fertility, soil erosion or whatever it, all the problems connected to soil will be correctly solved only if we look to soil as a living thing, not as just a non-living material, particles of dust and sand and clay and all that. So, this is the first or this is the starting point which you must have when you want to think about soil. Now, if the requirement for life is the soil has got to give you all the produce to sustain life. That is, it must have the capacity to produce all the which you need for your sustenance. This capacity to produce is what we should understand as the fertility of soil. See, this capacity to produce all our requirements is what we should understand as fertility of soils. So, the first and foremost thing is that we must look to the soil having the capacity to produce all our needs. That means we have got to guard it and see that it continues to go on producing all the requirements and not get depleted or polluted or destroyed. We have got to guard it, we have got to protect it, we have got to nurture it. So, this is the first step we have got to take when we deal about soils, that namely it is a living entity and it has got a life of its own. From that arises the property of soil or the capacity of soil, namely fertility. So, how do we understand fertility of soils? Fertility is not soil. Fertility is a property of the soil. It is a capacity of the soil, and this capacity generally is what we understand as the health of the soil, because what do we understand by health? Health is a thing which is capable of self-renewing itself and to maintain life. So, this capacity for self-renewal is what is termed as the health of the soil. That means our problem is to maintain the health of the soil. If you maintain the health of the soil, from that arises the capacity to produce all that we need. Unless we have that attitude towards soil, we will not succeed in our efforts. Now, this brings about a very important and moral question, and that question again cannot be separated from our attitude towards soils and our understanding of soils. Namely, what for do you want to use this soil? What for do you want to increase the fertility? What for? It must be again to protect life, to sustain life. Increasing the fertility of the soil for itself is not only wrong, morally wrong, but as we go on dealing with it, it will become very harmful, because ultimately we will end in ruining that soil. So, unless this important function of soil and its fertility, namely to sustain life. See, as it is, for example, you see our soils all the world over, and including India, is capable of producing a lot. Millions and millions of tons of food grains are there in the food corporation of India godowns, isn't it? So, are we going to increase the fertility of soils in order to increase the more and more millions of godowns? Where is it that that food should go? It should go into the stomachs of the hungry. So, unless hunger is linked up with the increase in fertility of the soils, merely looking to fertility soils becomes meaningless. What for do you want to increase the fertility soil? To put them in godowns? Or is it to feed the hungry? So, unless the question of hunger of the masses, of the people, is linked up with the problem of increasing the fertility, it will become an absolutely useless thing to think about soil. Better we think about something else. So, whenever we think of fertility of soils or its fertility, we have got to think about its function of trying to solve the problem of hunger. This is the second point. First is to consider soil as a living entity. Second is that the function of that soil and its fertility is to lessen hunger in the world. This is the social responsibility that we have got to take. This is the moral basis for increasing the fertility of the soils. So, unless this important function of solving hunger is linked up with the problem of the fertility of soil and increasing the fertility, our efforts are, well, not going to be morally correct. So, that is the second thing which we have got to look at. Now, when we think about fertility of soils or the capacity to go on producing our needs, there are any number of factors involved, very many factors, some of which we do not even know. But we know sufficiently enough number of factors which we can undertake immediately without waiting for more information to increase the fertility of soils. Now, three requirements are needed. Three important requirements are needed in order to increase the fertility of soils. Let us start with thinking about how does a plant grow. The seed is put in the soil, germination takes place, a root system develops, then the trunks and the canopy and all that thing. Now, the tree or the plant is sustained by the soil. How? How exactly does it take place? How does it take place? The roots of the plant derive the nutrition for the plant from the soil. This is how the plant grows, isn't it? I mean, I am going into some very simple things which we are missing today in our practices. The roots of the plant derive the nutrition needed for the growth of the plant. That is, the root function becomes a very, very critical component, you see, for the growth of the thing. If the roots die, the plant dies. Now, how exactly and where from do these roots get their nutrition? Of course, broadly it is from the soil. But soil, as I said, apart from being living, is also made up of various particles, sand particles and all that thing. Soil material is there. The roots do not go into the particles of the soil, isn't it? It does not go into the clay particle, into the sand particle, into the thing. It does not go there. The space between the particles is where the tip of the root goes. I mean, this is a very difficult thing, but I think we should get this concept very clearly. The tiny roots, or the root hairs as they are called, suck up not from inside the particle soil materials, but between the spaces between two number or any number of particles. It is a space. It is there, you see, from where the roots get their water, get their nutrition, get their air and everything. So, if we are thinking about fertility, improving the fertility of the soils, we must think of increasing the space between soil particles, because it is only within the spaces of the soil particles that the roots go. The roots do not go into the material itself. So, this is the first requirement for increasing the fertility of soils, namely increase the space. It is generally called the pore space of soils. Now, then it becomes our problem, what are the factors that will improve this pore space? If we agree that pore space is important, it has got to be increased. What are the factors, what are the methods, what are the conditions under which this pore space will get enlarged or increased? Now, for that, if we take say 2 particles of sand, the normal tendency will be for them to be very, very near each other, one over the other, or they must be separated. Only then the space will be there for the roots to go there, isn't it? Now, how can we keep these particles apart? Obviously, we can't be working there. Organic matter, when introduced in the soils, keeps these particles away from each other. So, the introduction of organic matter into the soils becomes the first procedure to increase the pore space between the particles of matter. So, introduction of organic matter, incorporation of organic matter into soils creates the important condition of pore space. Now, in these spaces between there, of course, water is harvested, water moisture is there, air also is there and all that thing. But then the nutrition has got to be in the form that the roots will be able to take. The nutrition for the plant must be in forms which the roots will take. For example, suppose we take food in forms which we will be able to digest, Similarly, the roots of the plant must be able to get those nutritional factors and elements in forms which it will be able to absorb and digest. Now, how does this take place? This takes place due to the activity of life within soils, that is the soil organisms which inhabit within the soils. The soil organisms which inhabit within soils, their job happens to be conversion of all the organic waste into products products of nutrition which the roots will be able to absorb for growth of the plant. So, the second important thing, first is incorporation of organic matter into the soils. The second important thing is to see that the living organism, that is the life within soils, micro and macroorganisms, are maintained. Any method, agricultural method or agricultural practice or fertilizing practices and all that thing, which destroys these living organisms within the soil, have got to be avoided. Because it is only these soil organisms which convert the waste, the organic waste, which we are incorporating in order to bring about the space, increase the space. If these organisms are not there, then the mere organic matter is not a food for the plants. It has got to be converted into forms which will be capable of being digested by the plant through the root system. Now, that conversion of the waste into nutritional factors is done only by the things which are there living within the soil, namely the soil life. If the soil organisms are not acting upon the waste matter and the organic matter and all that thing, nutrition of the plants will not exist. See, there is a difference here. That is to say, it is not enough if you have soil, it is not enough if you have moisture in the soil. You must have the soil organisms there who will convert all the waste into nutritional factors capable of being absorbed by the root system of the plant. So, these two important procedures or things which have got to be taken up if we are thinking of increasing fertility of soils. First is to put as much of organic waste and organic material into the soils, and second is give conditions so that these soil organisms are able to live there and convert the waste into nutritional forms for the roots of the plant to take up. That is to say, the entire process of converting waste into factors of nutrition of the plant is a living process, because the living organisms in the soil are the ones that are acting upon that waste. So, this is the second crucial thing that we must think about the soil, namely the presence, existence and increase of the soil life, of life within soils. Anything that inhibits, that is anything that slows down this growth of the existence of the soil organisms, anything that destroys the soil organisms will not result in fertility of the soils, because the roots will be starved of the nutritional factors. In other words, the soil organisms are like cooks who cook the food for the plant. You get rid of the cooks, there won't be food, starvation, the plant dies, then the soil collapses. See, they are more or less the cooks who convert, who make the thing available. So, this is the second important thing which we must bear in mind when we think about increasing soil fertility. Now, that is, in other words, we are nearing to understand what soil fertility is. Broadly, of course, we have defined it as the capacity for producing things, but we now are getting a little more clear that, namely, humus or organic matter which is put into the soils becomes the most important activity that we have got to do. When you do that, the soil organisms take up the job of manufacturing them into food. That is, soils which have got a lot of organic matter, we can think as soils which are trying to become more fertile. They are not yet fertile. That is, when do we call a soil fertile? We call that soil is a fertile soil where there is lot of humus or organic matter into the soil, which enables the spore, the space between the things to increase. And second is, this organic matter acts as food for the soil organism in order to make food for the plant. This is the linkage which we must think of. This is the linkage we can think of. That is, if we are able to provide these things, only then the soil will be healthy. Only then, when we say healthy, only then it will be capable of producing what we need for our sustenance. Now, if we look to the soil as a non-living thing, and if we start using only chemicals, you see, for some production and all that thing, it's true, you will get something, but they will not be natural products. They will be artificial products. And artificial products and unnatural products do not form the basis of health, either of the soil or of the plant or of animals, and including humans. That is, in other words, now we can be clear that soils which contain a lot of organic matter, soils where lot of organisms are existing within. See, it's very interesting. You see, if you take 1 acre of land, fertile or not, the weight of the soil organisms within the soil is at least 20 or 30 times the weight of all the living things above the soil. Interesting. 20 to 30 times the weight. That is, if you are in a position to gather all the soil organisms and weigh them, and if you are able to gather all the living things on the surface of the soil, including yourself, myself, elephants, horses, donkeys, everything, if you weigh them, the weight of the soil organisms within the soil will be many times the weight of all those things. So, you find that health of the soil is dependent upon this soil life. And since no life can exist without food, waste matter becomes the food of the organism. That is converted. This is the linkage that takes place. So, when we think of health of the soil, it means more and more organic matter into the soil, protection for the soil organisms within the soil, and of course, provision of air and water. No living thing can be without air and water, without oxygen. So, these are the prerequisites. These are the important concepts which we must have when we are thinking of increasing the fertility of the soils. Because we do not have this concept, and for various other reasons, we think, you see, that inorganic chemicals can increase the fertility. It does not. See, today, after about 50 years of use of artificials and synthetics for increasing the fertility of soils, world over, it is being recognized that the fertility of soils is going down. So, unless we change that attitude towards the soil, and do not think of soil as something, you see, which will go on receiving any amount of chemicals. That is, in other words, we must not think of plants as being patras for receiving only chemicals. It has got to get natural products produced out of organic matter by the soil organisms within the soil. Only then we will call it health. Only that kind of living, that kind of health can reproduce itself. See. That is I would like to gather up what I have talked till now, that namely we have got to think of soil and consider soil as a living entity if we are thinking of trying to have living plants. Living plants means living animals, living human beings and all that thing. And since soil is the place where all this life starts, and if we consider that as living, then you see we find that those two requirements, namely space between particles of thing and protection of the soil organisms and provision of food and energy for those soil organisms to convert them into nutritional factors for the plant. This must be the basic approach towards increasing the fertility of soils. This is as far as the technical aspect of it is concerned. The social aspect, agriculture is a social activity. So, unless we think of increasing the fertility in order to support life, in order to sustain life, all these were